Della Rourke stood on a blizzard-cold platform at Ray Station, Colorado, one April morning in 1881, and the day changed everything, though no one there yet knew it, least of all her. She had stepped down from a stock car 2 doors back, 40 head of her father's cattle penned behind her, and a coiled lariat looped over the strap of her travel bag, when a rancher named Gideon Marsh came toward her across the platform with his mother's ring warm in his coat pocket and a stranger's name half-formed on his lips. Before he got the name out, Della lifted one hand, the same hand she used to turn a spooked calf back into a herd, and delivered the 4 words that undid his whole careful plan. "You sent for the wrong bride." He didn't drop the ring. He closed his fingers around it, right there in his pocket, and did something Della would spend the next 27 days trying to puzzle out. He smiled. "Then I'm glad to meet whoever you actually are." He put out his empty hand to shake instead of the ring he'd been ready to offer. "Because you rode a long way to bring a stranger bad news in person, and that isn't a small thing to do for someone you've never met. I have spent a good deal of time in old county ledgers and ranch records from that stretch of the eastern Colorado plains, and I will tell you plainly, that line, more than any other in the whole account, is the one that made me want to understand this story properly. A man who learns at a train platform that his intended bride isn't coming usually reddens or storms off or blames whoever carries the news. Gideon Marsh kept the ring closed in his fist and thanked the woman who delivered his disappointment instead. To understand why he did that, and what it would cost him 27 days later to go on doing it, you need to know both fires this story burns on, hers and his. Stay for both. Della Rourke had not come to Ray Station to marry anyone. 3 days earlier, she'd been minding the only business she ever much cared for, which was cattle, not correspondence. She was 25, raised on a hardscrabble spread outside Amarillo, and for 6 years she had ridden point and drag, and everything between on her father's outfit, pushing stock north along the rail spurs to buyers who paid better across the territory line than they ever did at home. It suited her a good deal better than any kitchen had. That week she was escorting 40 head to a buyer outside Ray and riding the same eastbound train, 2 cars up, as a woman named Winifred Payne, who was minding a great deal of romance and watching all of it come apart. Winifred had written back to Gideon's notice in a Denver paper 8 months before, charmed by talk of open sky and good grass that she had pictured wrongly as something nearer a tidy park. She had corresponded pleasantly all winter, packed a trunk of dresses suited to nothing a ranch would ever ask of her, and somewhere past Lyman, watching the land go flat and enormous in every direction with not one familiar thing in it, she understood all at once that she had made a mistake too large to talk herself out of. She would not get off the train. She sat rigid as it slowed into the station, staring straight ahead while the conductor pleaded with her, and caught the sleeve of the nearest capable-looking woman in the car, which happened to be Della, coming back from checking on her cattle, and begged her, with real tears in her eyes, to carry a folded letter out to whoever was waiting, because she could not bear to watch his face when he read it. Della had no reason on earth to agree to it. She had cattle to sell and a train to catch onward, and no acquaintance whatsoever with the disappointed rancher of Ray Station. She agreed anyway, for a reason she could not fully explain to herself later, beyond the plain fact that somebody had to, and the somebody standing in the doorway happened to be her. She had meant to hand the letter over and be gone inside 2 minutes. That is not in the end how the 2 minutes went. Once his hand had come back down from the shake he'd offered, Della held out an envelope. "There's a letter. She wanted me to give it to you instead of saying it herself. I read enough on the ride over that I can save you some of it, if you'd rather hear it plain than read it dressed up." Gideon nodded. "Plain, then." "She's not comin'." She got as far as looking at Colorado out a train window and decided Colorado was a good deal more Colorado than she'd pictured. "She's sorry, and I believe she means it. She's not a bad woman. She's just the wrong woman for this particular piece of ground, and she worked that out about 300 miles too late to say so kindly in a letter, so she left it for me to say kindly instead." Gideon looked down at the unopened letter a long moment, and something crossed his face that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite relief, and landed somewhere honest between the two. "I'm obliged to you," he said finally. "Riding herd on your own cattle and a stranger's heartbreak in the same week seems a poor bargain for you." "Wasn't much of a bargain," Della agreed. "Wasn't going to let a man stand on a platform and find out the hard way either. Some things a person ought to hear from a person, even if it's the wrong person telling it." She turned to go. She had a buyer waiting, and 40 head drawing feed money out of her pocket every hour they sat idle in the stock pens, and the errand, kindly done, was finished. It was Gideon who kept her standing there longer than either of them had planned. "Miss Rourke, before you go, I don't suppose you'd know a rancher hereabouts needing an extra hand for a month. I find myself in considerably more trouble than a missing bride, and it happens to be exactly the kind of trouble a person who rides better than she talks might be useful for." Della looked at him properly for the first time, past the ring he still hadn't put away, and the plain disappointment settling into his shoulders, and something in the shape of the question caught her interest, the way a strange brand catches a cattle woman's eye at 50 paces. Trouble how? The trouble, once Gideon laid it out over coffee at the Ray Station Hotel, wasn't romance at all. It was paper, and paper is often the meaner enemy. His father, Elias Marsh, had built the Keystone Ranch out of 9,000 acres of good grass and 2 decades of stubbornness, and had died the winter before, leaving a will that every lawyer who read it named the work of a proud man determined to run his son's life from the grave. The Keystone would pass whole and clear to Gideon, the will read, provided he was a married man keeping a household by his 30th birthday. Failing that, the ranch would split in half with his cousin, Amos Marsh, a man who had never once pulled a calf or strung a fence wire in his life, but who had spent the last several months in quiet, steady correspondence with a land agent for the railroad. Gideon turned his coffee cup a slow half-circle. "My father thought a wife would settle me. Mostly, I think he was afraid of exactly what's happening now. Amos wants to sell his half the day the deadline runs out, railroad or cattle syndicate, whoever pays first. And once outside, money owns half the Keystone. The whole ranch goes inside 2 years, mine included." Della raised an eyebrow. "So you advertised for a wife, like ordering seed corn out of a catalog." "I'm not proud of the method." Gideon spread his hands. "I am, however, 27 days from losing the only thing my father ever built, and pride is a luxury I find myself short on this particular spring." Della sat with her coffee going cold, turning the whole shape of it over in her mind the way she'd turn over a horse before buying it, checking the legs, the teeth, the temperament, all at once. You're asking a stranger you met an hour ago to marry you. That's a bigger ask than a spare hand for a month. I'm asking a stranger I met an hour ago to help me keep a ranch. How that help gets arranged on paper or otherwise is a conversation for later, and only if you're willing to have it at all. I was engaged to a woman I never once met for 8 months, and it came to nothing. I'm not fool enough to believe a wedding fixes anything that isn't already true underneath it. But I've got 27 days and a lawyer doing a decent job of an indecent errand for my cousin, and I'd rather spend those days working alongside somebody honest than waiting on somebody who's already made plain to me, through a stranger and a folded letter, that she doesn't want the life. It was, Della thought, possibly the strangest proposal ever delivered over lukewarm hotel coffee, and also, uncomfortably, one of the more honest conversations she'd had with a man in years. I've got a buyer waiting on 40 head. I can give you 2 days while I settle that business. After that, I've got my father's outfit to answer to, and they're not expecting me to marry a Colorado rancher on my way home from a cattle sale. Gideon didn't argue the point. 2 days is a start. I've learned to work fast this spring. Whatever Della had pictured of the Keystone, she'd imagined something threadbare and desperate to match a man reduced to advertising for a wife in a Denver paper. The reality surprised her. The house was sound, the fences tight, the herd fat on good spring grass, and the 4 hands, all older men who'd ridden for Elias Marsh a decade or better, watched her arrival with the wary courtesy of men waiting to see whether a newcomer could actually work before they decided whether to like her. She settled that question by sundown of the first day, roping a lamed heifer out of a bog on the second throw and setting the leg herself, cleaner than the ranch's own foreman would have managed it. By supper, the 4 hands had stopped saying ma'am with the careful edges on it and started saying it the way you say it to someone who's earned the word outright. Gideon watched all of this with an expression Della caught twice and couldn't quite name. Not surprise exactly. Something nearer recognition, the way you look at a tune you can't place but know you've heard before. The 2 days stretched, honestly and without much ceremony on either side, into 4, then a week. There was real work to be done, and Della found herself doing it, culling, branding, riding fence with a competence that made the arrangement feel less like charity and more like a partnership neither of them had quite named out loud. In the evenings they sat on the porch with the lawyer's letters and the will's exact wording spread between them, working the problem like 2 people solving a puzzle rather than 2 people falling into anything. That, Della thought privately, was probably the safest way for it to happen, if it was happening at all. She kept her old canvas coat close through those first cold nights, the one with her mother's stitching worked into the shoulder, a small pattern of running birds sewn in red thread where an old tear had once been mended. Her mother had put that pattern into everything, saddle blankets, coats, her brother's shirts when they tore, and always claimed a plain patch was an insult to good canvas. Della had never thought twice about it. It was simply how a thing got mended right. Gideon gave her on the 5th evening not flowers and not declarations, but a spare pair of leather gloves off his own workbench, better fitted than the worn-through ones she'd traveled in. Can't have my foreman working bare-handed." Neither of them made anything of the word foreman, though both of them noticed it land. Amos Marsh rode out on the 9th day to see for himself what his cousin was up to, and didn't bother hiding his displeasure at finding a competent stranger running cattle, instead of a heartbroken bachelor running out the clock. "Word in town is your bride never arrived," Amos said, not bothering to dismount, looking Della over the way a man sizes up a horse he means to disqualify on a technicality, and that whoever this is, she's some drover's daughter, picked up off a train platform for the occasion. A judge is going to want to know this marriage is genuine, cousin, and not paper dressed up to beat a deadline. I intend to see that he asks. Ask away." Della didn't wait for Gideon to answer, her voice the same one that had settled 40 head of nervous cattle onto a rail car without once being raised. "I've branded more of this outfit's calves in 9 days than you've branded in your whole life, Mr. Marsh. Go ahead and tell your judge that a woman who can rope, doctor, and keep books isn't a genuine wife just because she arrived on a stock train instead of a passenger coach. I expect he'll have opinions about which one of you understands what a ranch marriage actually is." Amos had no answer for that, and rode off considerably less certain of his railroad money than he'd arrived. Gideon watched her a long moment after the dust had settled. "You didn't have to fight that battle," he said. "It's mine." "It's ours," Della said, and heard what she'd spoken, and didn't take it back. It was the first time either of them had spoken the word out loud, and neither made a show of it, and both noticed anyway. A letter caught up to Della on the 12th day, forwarded from the buyer's office in Ray, and it wasn't the kind that made staying any simpler. It was from her father. He was glad the cattle had sold well. He mentioned, in the same unhurried hand he used for everything from branding schedules to bad news, that a rancher named Thomas Reeves had come by the house twice that month asking after her, and that Reeves ran a sound outfit 2 counties over, and that a man who inquired after a woman twice in 1 month while she was 300 miles from home was a man worth a serious answer one way or another. Her father didn't tell her what to do. He never had. He laid the facts on the table the way he laid a saddle before a long ride, and let her decide what she was riding into. Della read the letter 3 times sitting on the porch steps, and Gideon, coming out to check the evening stock, saw her face and had the good sense not to ask. She wrote back that night by lamplight, and tore up 2 drafts before she let the 3rd one stand. She gave her father the truth, because lying to him had never once worked in 25 years, and she saw no reason to start now. She laid out the wrong bride and the 27 days, and a rancher who'd handed her honest work instead of a honeyed promise, and a ranch that felt, God help her, more worth fighting for with every day that passed. She wrote that Thomas Reeves was a good man, and that she wasn't in any position to promise him anything, because she didn't currently know what she was promising herself. She did not mention the coat, because she didn't yet know what the coat meant. That recognition was still 9 days off, waiting for her in a torn saddle blanket and a line of red thread. What she did write, near the bottom of the page, was this: "You always taught me a person ought to choose the harder true thing over the easier maybe. I don't know yet if this is the true thing. I know it isn't the easy one, and for once in my life that isn't scaring me off it." Her father's answer came back 3 weeks later, short as always. He let Thomas Reeves know, kindly, that his daughter's heart appeared to be otherwise occupied, and Reeves, being a decent sort about it, wished her well and married a neighbor's schoolteacher cousin within the year, which suited him fine in the end. But that answer came later. In the meantime, Della sat with the not knowing, which was its own kind of work, harder in some ways than any calf she'd ever pulled. She had built her whole life on reading sign correctly, a lame horse from a lazy one, a genuine buyer from a time-waster at 50 paces. She had never once had to read her own heart the same way, and found it considerably harder going than any trail she'd ridden. She stayed anyway. Not because the deadline demanded it, though it did, and not because the ranch needed her, though it plainly did that too. She stayed because some mornings now, watching Gideon ride the fence line at first light with the same patient thoroughness he brought to everything, she caught herself hoping the count of remaining days would move slower than it did. That, she thought, watching him from the porch with her father's letter still folded in her coat pocket, was probably an answer in itself, whether she was ready to read it yet or not. Amos didn't ride out again. He went to the county seat instead, which was worse. He filed a petition with a circuit judge brought in special from Sterling, a plain, unsentimental man named Silas Bramwell, asking that any marriage completed in the final days before the deadline be examined for what his lawyer phrased, in careful language, as want of genuine intent. He had witnesses lined up, the station master, who would testify that the expected bride had never once stepped off the train, and the hotel clerk, who would testify that an entirely different woman had checked into a room that same afternoon. It wasn't an unreasonable petition, dressed up as it was in reasonable words, and that was exactly what made it dangerous. "He's not wrong about the facts," Gideon said, reading the filing at the kitchen table with a grimness Della hadn't seen on him before. "He's just wrong about what they mean. A judge who doesn't know either of us reads this and sees exactly what Amos wants him to see. A rancher panicked by a deadline. A woman paid off a passing train. Nobody's paying me." "I know that. You know that. A stranger reading a filing at a desk in Sterling doesn't know that." Gideon rubbed his eyes. Hearing set for the 25th, 2 days before the deadline. If Bramwell rules the marriage was arranged in bad faith, the whole condition fails whether we're married by the 27th or not, and Amos gets his half free and clear. Della thought about it a moment. "Then we'd better give the judge something realer to look at than a filing full of facts arranged sideways. Facts arranged honest usually beat facts arranged clever. I've seen it happen at cattle auctions more times than I can count." She didn't say, because she hadn't fully allowed herself to know it yet, that the facts had stopped feeling arranged at all somewhere around the 9th day, and had started feeling simply true. To understand what happened next, you have to go back 3 winters, to a storm that neither of them, until that week, knew they had shared. In the winter of 1878, Gideon had ridden with his father's outfit on a late drive across the Cimarron Cutoff, pushing 800 head south against advice and against weather that had no business turning as fast as it did. The storm came down with almost no warning, a wall of white that swallowed the sun inside 20 minutes, and Gideon, chasing a break in the herd, got separated from the outfit and thrown when his horse went down in a drift he never saw coming. He lay in the snow long enough to stop feeling his hands, which every man on that trail knew was the last stop before you stopped feeling everything else. What saved him was a stranger. A young cowgirl riding drag on a different outfit's herd a mile east saw a riderless horse circling and went looking on nothing but instinct and stubbornness. She found him half buried, cut a fire out of what dry brush she could scrape together, wrapped him in her own coat and blanket, and sat up through the worst of the night, keeping him talking so he wouldn't slip under. By the gray hour before dawn, with the wind finally dropping, she had gotten him onto her own horse, walked him 3 miles to a line shack, built a second fire, and left before full light without ever giving her name, because she had 800 head of somebody else's cattle scattered across a blizzard and a job left to finish. Gideon had spent 3 years trying to describe that night to people who hadn't been in it, and always failing. He remembered the coat most of all, an old canvas thing, too big for her, mended at one shoulder with a line of unmistakable red thread stitched into a pattern like small running birds. He remembered a voice that never once let fear into it, even when his own had started to. He did not remember her face clearly. The cold takes faces first and gives them back last. He had inquired after her for a year at every ranch within 200 miles. Nobody claimed her. Eventually he had stopped asking, and folded the memory away the way a person folds away a coat too painful to wear and too important to give away, and gotten on with the business of living, until a woman stepped off a train at Ray Station claiming to be the wrong bride entirely. The recognition, when it came, was almost nothing at all. That is usually how the real ones arrive. 9 days before the hearing, mending a torn saddle blanket by lamplight on the porch, Della ran a needle through canvas in a small, quick pattern she had sewn 1,000 times without thinking about it, a line of stitches shaped, if you looked close, like a row of running birds. Gideon, sitting across the porch with the lawyer's papers forgotten in his lap, went very still. "Where did you learn that stitch?" Della didn't look up from the needle. "My mother's. She sewed it into everything, saddle blankets, coats, my brother's shirts when they tore. A plain patch was an insult to good canvas, she liked to say." She glanced up, caught his face, and stopped. "Gideon, what's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," he said slowly. "I think something might finally be right, and I don't quite trust it yet. Winter of '78, the Cimarron cutoff south of the Forks. The worst storm anybody on that drive had ever seen. Does any of that mean something to you?" Della's hands went still on the needle. "There was a rider," she said, quiet now, the whole shape of her attention changing. "Thrown, half frozen, alone. I never got his name, didn't have time to ask it, and didn't much think I'd see him again to need it. I gave him my coat, the old canvas one, and walked him into a line shack, and left before light, because I had cattle scattered clear toward the Kansas line." She looked at him properly now, searching, adding years backward onto his face the way a person ages a photograph in her mind. Gideon's jaw tightened. "That coat had my mother's stitching on the shoulder. I still have it. I never could give it away. It's folded in a trunk in the house this very minute." The writer Mark Twain, who traveled that same wide country in those very years, once wrote that truth is stranger than fiction, because fiction is obliged to stick to possibilities, and truth is under no such obligation at all. Gideon had read that line once in a newspaper and thought it a clever turn of phrase. Sitting on his own porch 9 days before a hearing that could cost him everything, looking at the woman who had once kept him alive in a storm and then walked out of his life before dawn without a name, he understood it finally as something closer to Scripture. You saved my life and never once gave me your name. Gideon shook his head slowly. And 3 years later, you met me on a train platform and let me know, before anything else, that I'd sent for the wrong bride. He almost laughed, and it came out closer to something else. Della Rourke, I don't believe you've ever once in your life been the wrong anything. The hearing on the 25th lasted 11 minutes, which was 11 minutes longer than it needed to be, because Judge Bramwell, a plain and unsentimental man by every account, was moved despite himself. Amos's lawyer laid out the timeline exactly as filed: a missing bride, a stranger off a stock train, a convenient marriage assembled inside a deadline. It was a tidy story, and it fell apart the moment Gideon stood up uninvited and laid out for the court a blizzard on the Cimarron cutoff in the winter of '78, and a coat with a mother's stitching folded in a trunk for 3 years, and put to the judge plainly whether a marriage built on a debt 3 winters old and a rescue that had wanted nothing in return sounded like fraud to him, or sounded like the single most genuine thing either party involved had ever done in their lives. Judge Bramwell had only one question for Della. Did she love this man, separate from any ranch, any deadline, any cousin's ambition? I loved the shape of him before I ever learned his name, Della said. The ranch is just where I finally caught up to it. The petition was dismissed. Amos left the courthouse considerably poorer in prospects than he had entered it, and sold his eventual, much-reduced settlement to a cattle syndicate 2 years later for far less than the railroad would once have paid him. There is an arithmetic to greed that catches up with a man eventually, and Amos Marsh's caught up with him inside 2 years of that courtroom. They married on the morning of the 27th, Gideon's 30th birthday, in the yard at the Keystone, with the 4 hands standing witness and a circuit preacher who posed no questions he didn't already know good answers to. Della wore her own canvas riding skirt, mended at one knee in a small pattern of running birds, because a woman does not stop being the one who saved her groom in a blizzard just because the wedding finally caught up to the rescue. When Gideon slid his mother's ring onto her hand, the same ring he had carried in his pocket that first morning on the platform and never once put away, he let her know it had been waiting for the right woman a good deal longer than either of them had known. The old coat still hangs in the hall at the Keystone, mended shoulder and all. Neither of them has ever seen a reason to put it away. If this one found you where you needed it, there are more waiting, complete from first hoofbeat to last, right here on the Cowgirl Chronicles. Come sit by the fire a while longer. I'll leave the gate open for the next one.